still wild, and we have when the trouble.
She pinched her nose and watched me wade out to where the water reached my knees. Roughly here, I decided, was where Mitchell Sanders had found Kiowa's rucksack. I eased myself down, squatting at first, then sitting. There was again that sense of recognition. The water rose to mid-chest, a deep greenish brown, almost hot. Small water bugs skipped along the surface. Right here, I thought. Leaning forward, I reached in with the moccasins and wedged them to the soft bottom, letting them slide away. Tiny bubbles broke the surface. I tried to think of something decent to say, something meaningful and right, but nothing came to me.
And all the people you meet down in the streets may be good, but they don't want to know. So they cover their eyes.
This is Literature on the Mountain with Brandon Hall. Today, esteemed writer and Vietnam War vet Tim O'Brien will be joining us. Thank you for coming out here.
Thanks for having me, Brandon.
Could you please discuss a little bit an overview of the chapter Field Trip, which we will be discussing in depth today?
Certainly. The chapter, A Field Trip, in my book, The Things They Carried, is about this trip I took with my 9-year-old daughter, Kathleen. And we went out to Vietnam about 20 or so years after the war had ended. And it's a very important story to me personally because I make peace with my former life in Vietnam and move on to my next one with my daughter.
So, in the chapter, you're there with your daughter Kathleen, who is 9. You talk about how she found Vietnam to be very fascinating. Did this shock you or give you possibly a perspective on how people at home viewed the war differently than you had?
No, not really. I mean, my first experiences with Vietnam were obviously much different than it was for her. You know, I entered into a war zone expecting death every day, and she went into what I called the chapter basically a field trip, which was fun and exciting for her. At one point, I had considered that whether or not, from a parent's standpoint, that maybe maybe it wasn't such a great idea to bring my daughter into a former war zone, you see, where my friends were killed and I almost died numerous times myself. But I did find that I wanted her to be there. She may not have understood why we were there at the time, but it was so I could share my personal history with her. I wanted her to be there when I relived an event that has forever shaped my life.
I was burned out and lost, a dusty bolt, an abandoned lot, and the nighttime was the worst. It shows you all the things you lost.
Earlier in the book, you describe the incident where your friend Kiowa died in the marsh. As I read in this chapter, Field Trip, I can tell you use a much different way of describing the field this time around than you did in one of the previous chapters. Can you describe that image of the field 20 years later for us, and how much did it change for you?
Well, obviously, it had changed a lot for 20 years. It seemed much more peaceful this time around, I'd say. I heard the soft sounds of butterflies and birds, and the mud was dark brown, and small bugs swam across it, and the sun was very, very bright that day, I remember, and it made me squint to see. Everything seemed like a bright summer evening, and the sun was shining, and there were shady spots round, and the water was still and calm. It almost seemed like that incident or battle that had occurred 20 years ago had never actually happened. I mean, it was so calm. And there was no evidence of it either, with decades of history buried in the depth of that literal shitfield.
Now, we'd like to bring on a surprise guest, Miss Kathleen O'Brien, daughter of Mr. O'Brien. Welcome on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kathleen, tell us about your experience with your dad in Vietnam when he took you back.
Well, it was all very strange for me, being only 9. I didn't understand why we were there or what my dad had gone through in this place.
I can imagine that it would have been very difficult for you, being so young, to try to understand what your father was going through at the time, and just what did you see in when your father went into the water, or the marsh where his friend had fallen?
Well, it's hard for me to really remember, but I remember seeing the pain in my father's face and not understanding why we were there or what my father was doing. When he walked into the water, I was both scared and confused.
Now, a question for Mr. O'Brien. In the chapter, you spend quite a bit of time describing a man on the hill above where you and your daughter were in the village. Could you describe what this meant to you, or the connection that you had with this man?
Of course. And as I said in the chapter, my daughter asked about this as well. I believe that this was sort of an understanding between the two of us. We didn't really know each other, and he may not have fought in the war like I did. But he probably, most likely, lost someone to the war, a friend or a loved one, maybe even a child. I was there to honor and remember a valiant soldier and dear friend. I believe that he saw this, and he knew I wasn't doing anything disrespectful around his territory or native land. And I think he respected me for coming back to honor someone I fought with and loved. It came almost as a mutual understanding.
And going back a little bit on the scene where you're in the marsh, I have to ask about the muddy water. When you re-entered it, was this symbolic, or did this give you a feeling of reconnection or a sense of weight being lifted off of your shoulders?
Well, I never really thought of it as I had 20 years before. The smell and the color and the feeling of getting in all the water escaped me, and I focused just on Kiowa. I sat there for a few minutes, and I couldn't think of anything appropriate to say that would express how I felt and how much I missed him. So, unfortunately, I just kind of sat there and took in the sights and sounds, and that was about it.
I was scared, but I couldn't admit it.
I just think it's amazing how, as a Vietnam vet, you're able to connect with the reader on a more personal level. And this is a quality that many other Vietnam war vets in general have trouble with, which is connecting your emotions to your audience. And just what's the secret? How are you able to connect with your audience on a personal level and express to them the emotions that went on inside of you while you were in the conflict?
Well, I think the passage that was read earlier is a perfect example of what you're talking about. And you're right. The language is very simple, and there's a lot of details in this chapter and throughout the book, quite honestly. And I find that necessary because it's written as a memoir to Vietnam soldiers, my bad. And most of them were not well educated at that point. And it's very simplistic and descriptive language that it's easy to understand or connect with. I really find that the most important thing is that I can accurately explain what happened. And unfortunately, as I said before, Brandon, I couldn't think of the right things to say when I was there, and which is ironic, really, because I am a writer, and I felt like I should have come up with something very poetic and meaningful to say, but the words still escape me today, so I can't tell you how this connected to me too much on a personal basis, except for what I've already told you.
One last question. What would you like, as parting words, what would you like to get across to your audience of readers through this chapter?
Well, I think this chapter is mainly focused just on the meeting of the end and the beginning of a new life, the former life of Vietnam, and how I brought my daughter into the picture and made ends meet and made peace with my former life and began a new one and moved on.
Well, thank you so much for coming out here and being on air.
Well, thanks for having
Thank
us.
you.
This is Literature on the Mountain. I'm Brandon Hall. We'd like to acknowledge our producer, Will Markham, our storyteller and reader, Seth Kiker. And on a side note, we'd like to thank our sound producer and stage manager, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Qui-Gon Jinn. Thank you.
When she calls, how come to her? I had a dream last night, shaking